This stele is what the Egyptians would have called a triumph stele, a victory stele, commemorating victory over foreign peoples. The text reads, Ashkelon has been brought captive, Gezer has been taken captive, Yanoam in the North Jordan Valley has been seized, Israel has been shorn, its seed no longer exists.
More than 3,000 years ago, an Egyptian pharaoh carved his military victories into stone. He was not thinking about the Bible. He had never heard of Christianity or Islam. He believed he was recording nothing more than his own power. Yet hidden near the end of his inscription is a name that would survive him, his empire, and even entire civilizations. That name is Israel. Why does this matter? Because this single stone forces us to confront a simple but uncomfortable question. What happens when ancient evidence contradicts later claims about history? Today's discussion is not about theology, doctrine, or faith. It is about archaeology, language, and timing. We will examine what this stone actually says, why historians take it seriously, and how it quietly confirms something many believed could never be proven. This is not an argument, it is a record carved into stone, untouched by belief and impossible to erase. To understand why this inscription matters, we must begin with the physical object itself and the political world that produced it. The monument in question is commonly known as the Merneptah Stele. It is a tall slab of dark granite, over 10 feet high, covered on both sides with finely carved hieroglyphs. This was not a casual marker or a local record. Stones of this size and quality were expensive, labor-intensive, and reserved for messages a king wanted to last forever. The man who ordered it was Merneptah, son of Ramses II. By the time Merneptah came to the throne in the late 13th century BC, Egypt was no longer expanding at the explosive pace of his father's reign, but it was still a dominant regional power. Egypt controlled trade routes, enforced military dominance across Canaan, and routinely intervened in the politics of city-states stretching from modern Gaza to southern Lebanon. Egyptian royal inscriptions followed a clear pattern. Pharaohs did not write neutral history. They wrote victory. Defeats were omitted. Losses were ignored. Campaigns were exaggerated. The purpose was not accuracy in the modern sense, but authority. These inscriptions told subjects, rivals, and future generations one thing: Egypt ruled because the gods favored its king. Merneptah Stele fits this pattern precisely. Most of the text celebrates his victory over Libyan forces and their allies. It reads like standard royal propaganda, formal, confident, and highly selective. Nothing about it suggests religious commentary or concern for foreign traditions. The stele was discovered in 1806 by British archaeologist Flinders Petrie at Thebes, reused as building material in a later structure. At first glance, it appeared unremarkable compared to other Egyptian victory monuments. Only careful translation revealed why it would become one of the most discussed inscriptions in Near Eastern history. Near the end of the text, after lists of defeated cities and regions in Canaan, appears a brief line that breaks the usual rhythm. It introduces a name that is not presented as a city, not as a kingdom, and not as a territory. Instead, it is identified as a people. That single grammatical choice is where history changes direction. Merneptah did not set out to document anyone else's past. He intended to secure his own legacy, yet by following standard Egyptian conventions honestly, he left behind evidence that modern historians cannot ignore. The power of this stone lies not in what it tries to prove, but in what it assumes without explanation. The importance of the Merneptah Stele does not lie in its length or grandeur. It lies in one short passage near the end of the inscription, only a few lines long, that introduces a name with no explanation, no emphasis, and no justification. That lack of explanation is precisely why historians take it so seriously. After listing defeated cities and regions in Canaan, the text states, in commonly accepted translation, Canaan is captive with all woe, Ashkelon is conquered, Gezer is seized, Yanoam is made non-existent, Israel is laid waste, its seed is no more. At first glance, this looks like standard Egyptian boasting: cities destroyed, enemies defeated, victory proclaimed. But the grammatical structure of this sentence is what sets it apart. Egyptian hieroglyphic writing uses determinatives, small symbols placed at the end of words, to clarify what type of entity is being referenced. Cities have one set of determinatives. Lands have another. People groups have their own. Every location listed before Israel, Ashkelon, Gezer, Yanoam, is marked as a city or territory. Israel is not. Instead, Israel is marked with the determinative for a people group, not a place. This means the scribe was not referring to a city called Israel, nor a kingdom with defined borders. He was referring to a population, an ethnic or tribal group living within the region. This distinction is not theological, it is linguistic, and it carries enormous historical weight. It tells us several things with remarkable clarity. First, Israel existed as a recognizable people by approximately 1208 BC. This pushes external confirmation of Israel's presence far earlier than critics once allowed. Second, Israel was not yet a centralized state. There is no king mentioned, no capital city name. This aligns precisely with the biblical period described in the book of Judges, when Israel functioned as a loose tribal confederation rather than a monarchy. Third, Israel was located in Canaan, interacting, often violently, with the same city-states Egypt regularly campaigned against. This matches the biblical narrative of settlement rather than conquest of a fully established empire. What strengthens this evidence even further is intent. Merneptah was not attempting to document Israel's origins. He was not validating Hebrew tradition. He was recording enemies he believed he had defeated. In Egyptian royal logic, you only name opponents that actually exist and matter. In fact, mentioning Israel works against exaggeration. Listing a people group rather than a destroyed city suggests incomplete control, not total domination. If Israel had been fictional, vague, or insignificant, there would have been no reason to include the name at all. This is why historians across religious and secular lines agree on one point. The Merneptah Stele is the earliest non-biblical reference to Israel. It does not prove theology. It does not confirm miracles, but it does establish existence, time and place. Three foundations every historical discussion depends on. The Merneptah Stele is not controversial because of what it says. It is controversial because of when it says it and who says it. This inscription was carved around 1208 BC in Egypt, during a period when Egypt actively controlled large parts of Canaan. At that time, Israel is mentioned not as a legend, not as a future nation, and not as a religious idea, but as an existing people already living in the land. That timing is critical. For many years, some historians argued that Israel only emerged centuries later, possibly as a cultural or political development after the collapse of Bronze Age city-states. According to those views, the biblical account reflected a much later attempt to construct national identity, not early historical reality. The Merneptah Stele directly challenges that position because it predates later religious traditions by many centuries. The inscription cannot be explained as borrowing from biblical text, theological storytelling, or later editorial influence. It comes from a completely independent political power, using its own language, its own writing system, and its own worldview. Just as importantly, it does not exaggerate Israel's power. There is no claim of a kingdom, no claim of a king, no claim of a capital. The stele describes Israel exactly as archaeology and early biblical texts describe it at that stage. A decentralized people group, vulnerable, scattered, and not yet dominant. This is why scholars treat the inscription seriously even when they disagree on theology. The evidence is modest, precise, and limited, but that is what makes it reliable. The stone does not claim that Israel conquered the land, that biblical law was in effect, or that later religious traditions were already formed. What it does confirm is simpler and more foundational. Israel existed as a distinct people in Canaan by the late 13th century BC. Any historical framework, religious or secular, that places Israel's emergence much later must now account for this data point. Ignoring it is not a neutral position, it is a selective one. The Merneptah Stele does not demand belief, it demands explanation. It stands as a reminder that ancient history often survives not because someone wanted to preserve the truth, but because someone tried to glorify themselves. In doing so, Merneptah left behind something more durable than his military victories, a fixed reference point in time that anchors later debates to physical reality. Stone does not adapt to ideology. It does not revise itself to match modern narratives. It remains where it was placed, saying only what it was carved to say. To understand the true value of the Merneptah Stele, it is just as important to clarify what it does not say as what it does. This distinction protects the evidence from exaggeration and keeps the discussion grounded in serious historical method. The stele does not describe the Exodus. It does not mention Moses, Abraham, or the patriarchs. It does not reference covenant, law, or worship, and it does not claim that Israel ruled the land. This matters because responsible historical analysis does not ask evidence to prove more than it reasonably can. The Merneptah Stele gives us a snapshot, not a full narrative. It captures a moment in time when Egypt encountered a group known as Israel in Canaan. Nothing more and nothing less. That limitation is precisely why the inscription is considered reliable. If the stele had mirrored biblical language closely, critics would argue dependence or later influence. If it had described Israel as a powerful kingdom, it would conflict with archaeology. Instead, it aligns quietly with what we would expect from the late Bronze Age: fragmented populations, unstable settlements, and shifting power structures. Archaeological data from the highlands of Canaan supports this picture. Small villages appear in the late 13th century BC, lacking monumental architecture, palaces, or temples. These sites show cultural continuity with Canaanite material culture, but also distinct social patterns, suggesting emergence rather than invasion. This is where the stele becomes historically important without becoming overstated. It confirms presence, not dominance. It confirms identity, not theology. It confirms timing, not interpretation. That distinction matters because it prevents the evidence from being dismissed as propaganda on either side. The stele neither proves nor disproves religious belief. Instead, it anchors debate in something concrete, an external, contemporary reference carved by an unrelated political power. In historical study, this type of confirmation is rare and valuable. Most ancient peoples are known only from their own traditions. Israel is unusual in that its early existence is acknowledged by an outside empire with no interest in preserving Israel's story. Merneptah did not validate Israel's faith. He validated Israel's reality, and that is enough to change the terms of the discussion. One of the strongest principles in historical analysis is this: a hostile source is often more credible than a friendly one. The Merneptah Stele matters precisely because Merneptah had no reason, political, religious, or cultural, to support Israel's story. In fact, his interests pointed in the opposite direction. Egyptian royal inscriptions existed to magnify the king. They were instruments of intimidation and legacy building. Enemies were listed not to honor them, but to demonstrate Egyptian dominance. If a group did not exist, it would not be named. If it was insignificant, it would be ignored. If it was exaggerated, it would be reshaped into a city or kingdom to amplify the king's victory. Yet Israel appears on the stele in a restrained, technically precise way. Merneptah does not inflate Israel into a grand power. He does not claim total annihilation through occupation. He does not describe conquest of a capital or execution of a king. Instead, Israel is acknowledged as a people group, real enough to fight, real enough to be noticed, but not yet organized enough to be conquered like a state. This honesty is unintentional, and that is exactly why it matters. If the stele had been written by Israelites, critics could argue bias. If it had been written centuries later, critics could argue legend. If it had been written by allies, critics could argue propaganda. But this stone was carved by a foreign empire during a military campaign for domestic political purposes. It records what Egyptian officials believed to be true at the time, not what later generations wished had been true. Ironically, Merneptah was attempting to erase his enemies from memory. Israel is laid waste, its seed is no more, is the language of finality. Egyptian kings often used such phrases symbolically to declare dominance, not literal extermination. History itself disproves the claim. Israel did not disappear. Instead, the opposite happened. By carving Israel's name into stone, Merneptah ensured that Israel would be remembered long after his own victories faded from relevance. His enemies outlived his empire. His propaganda became their evidence. This is a recurring pattern in ancient history. Empires rise, declare absolute control, and fall. The groups they attempt to suppress often leave fewer records, but when their enemies mention them, those references become some of the strongest anchors historians possess. The Merneptah Stele does not argue for Israel. It does not defend Israel. It simply acknowledges Israel's existence, and in historical terms. That acknowledgement, coming from a hostile power, is exceptionally difficult to dismiss. When discussing ancient evidence, one of the most common mistakes is to project later religious debates backward onto earlier historical periods. The Merneptah Stele forces us to reverse that habit and move in the correct direction, from evidence to interpretation, not the other way around. The stele was carved more than 6 centuries before the rise of Islam and well over a millennium before many medieval religious disputes took shape. At the time it was written, there was no Jewish Bible in its final form, no Christianity, and no Islamic tradition. None of those frameworks influenced the inscription in any way. This matters because the stele does not participate in later theological arguments. It does not confirm one religion over another. Instead, it establishes a baseline historical fact that all later interpretations must contend with. A people known as Israel existed in Canaan by the late 13th century BC. Any later tradition, religious, political, or ideological, that addresses the origins of Israel must now answer a simple question. How does this Egyptian inscription fit into the timeline? Some traditions emphasize later developments of identity, law, or scripture. Others question the accuracy of early narratives. The Merneptah Stele does not invalidate those discussions, but it limits them. It removes the possibility of arguing that Israel was purely a late invention with no early historical presence. What makes the stele especially important is its independence. It does not rely on biblical transmission, oral tradition, or religious memory. It stands outside those systems entirely. That independence is what gives it weight in academic discussion. At the same time, the evidence remains restrained. The stele does not claim divine promise, exclusive ownership of land, or moral authority. It confirms existence, not entitlement. That distinction allows the evidence to be used responsibly rather than polemically in serious historical study. This is where balance matters most. The Merneptah Stele should neither be ignored nor overstated. It does not solve every question, but it prevents certain claims from being made without qualification. History rarely speaks in absolutes. More often, it draws boundaries around what can reasonably be denied. This stone does exactly that. It narrows the field of speculation and anchors discussion to a fixed point in time, one that cannot be moved forward or backward to suit later narratives. After removing belief, theology, and later interpretation, the Merneptah Stele leaves us with a narrow but powerful conclusion. By the late 13th century BC, a people known as Israel already existed in the land of Canaan. They were known to Egypt. They were significant enough to be named, and they were identified not as a city or a kingdom, but as a people, exactly as archaeology and early biblical texts independently suggest. This single fact does not prove every biblical account. It does not validate doctrine. It does not settle modern political or religious disputes. What it does do is far more basic and far more important for historical integrity. It establishes early existence. It confirms location. It fixes Timtamam, because the inscription comes from a hostile foreign power with no interest in preserving Israel's story. It carries unusual credibility. Merneptah did not intend to document Israel's past. He intended to glorify himself. In doing so, he unintentionally preserved a reference that later generations cannot ignore. This is how history often works. Truth survives not because someone defends it, but because someone records something they assume needs no defense at all. The stone still stands. The words remain unchanged. Empires fell, religions emerged, debates multiplied, yet the inscription stays silent and firm, offering neither argument nor apology, only evidence. And that raises a final question worth leaving open. If a single line carved by an enemy can survive 3,000 years and still shape how we understand the past, how many other assumptions about ancient history deserve to be re-examined? Not through belief, but through evidence? That question is not about faith, it is about honesty with the past.